4 is called Colonizing Colonizing Bodies and Minds, Gender and Colonialism. And so I actually find the first part of this chapter to be the most interesting for me, because she kind of gives some historical justification for the chapter, and she does it in quite a really interesting way, I think. Shout out to you, Jetem Ross, peace, welcome Yaya. And yeah, she starts. She says she refers to Frantz Fanon. Interestingly, Fanon is someone who I may read one of his books, maybe Black Skin, White Masks at some point in future. But she starts with the observation from the likes of Frantz Fanon and also someone called Albert Memmi, and she starts with the observation they made, which is that colonialism bifurcates the world, or splits the world into two entities: the colonized and the colonizer. And she said, "Yeah, that's what colonialism does. It basically, the social ontology of colonialism, it kind of does do that, colonize and colonizer." But Oyewumi says that there's actually a similarity between the colonized and colonizer, which doesn't get talked about as much. So while yes, the colonizer and the colonizer are two distinct camps, if you like, in colonialism, she points out that in the writing of their history, both the colonizer and the colonized are presumed to be men. And then she gives a quote from Fanon to justify this point. And the quote this is on page 121. It says, "Yet the following two passages from Fanon are typical of the portrayal of the native or the colonized in the discourses on colonization." Quote from Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth, or The Damned of the Earth. "Sometimes people wonder that the native, rather than give his wife a dress, buys instead a transistor radio," unquote. And then another quote from Fanon in Wretched of the Earth. Quote, "The look that the native turns on the settler's town is a look of lust, a look of envy. It expresses his dreams of possession, all manner of possession, to sit at the settler's table, to sleep in the settler's bed, with his wife, if possible. The colonized man is an envious man," unquote. So that assumption, that characterization of the colonized as being male. And then Oyewumi says, "But what if the native were female, as indeed many of them were? How is this feeling of envy and desire to replace the colonizer manifested or realized for women? Or, for that matter, does such a feeling exist for women?" So that was a really, I love that, because she's like, yeah, Fanon, these guys say that the world is split between colonized and colonizer. Yeah. However, she's like, and she does come back later and talks about Fanon, glowingly. She does refer to Fanon glowingly. So she's not trying to like call him out and just say he was full of rubbish or anything like that. But I just love the fact that she uses that as a springboard to basically go on to justify why she thinks that colonialism, particularly in the Yoruba context, should be, which is why she's analyzing colonialism with a gendered lens, if you like. Then she says this. She quotes from somebody who I think is Memmi. This might be from Memmi, who I've not heard of, but I've seen there. Everything is Politics said that please do a review of both books, Fanon and Memmi. Yeah, I definitely. I've never heard of Albert Memmi before, to my shame. So I'll check that Albert out. But Fanon has absolutely been on my radar for ages, particularly since I started getting into Afro-pessimism, and they're, Frank Wilderson and these guys are constantly going back to Frantz Fanon, so it makes sense to kind of read some Fanon. So she gives this quote. She says, "Colonial custom and practice stemmed from, quote, a worldview which believes in the absolute superiority of the human over the non-human and the subhuman, the masculine over the feminine, and the modern or progressive over the traditional or savage." And isn't that the truth, that Western philosophy generally, but colonialism certainly, it has those dichotomies. Is that what they call them? Dichotomies in post-colonialists talk a lot about these binaries. That's the word, binaries. So male, female, modern, traditional, human, non-human is an important one. And I just want to say there that I'm definitely also going to be touching on some work by some of these other authors, such as Nkiru Nzegu, because she talks a lot about that. She talks a lot about, she's trying to center, she talks about this thing called Ordinani ontology, which is an Igbo based idea, you know, the Igbo cosmology and ontology, whereby the Earth, the planet, the Earth, is central to everything, rather than the Western concept whereby man is central, white man is central to everything. She talks about how, you know, in Ordinani ontology, the Earth is central. But anyway, that's a side issue. So she talks about how race and gender basically have common roots, and you know, that's important as well, because in as much as she's been talking about how colonialism genderized the world and genderized Yoruba society, it's important for her to point out here that actually, as Paul Morris, you made a point last time or the time before about how race is, you know, gender is essentially a racial construct, and she talks about the connection between gender and race, like here. She says that on page 122 that the colonizer differentiated between male and female. Oh, sorry, that's not the one. Race and gender categories obviously emanate from the preoccupation in Western culture with the visual and hence physical aspects of human reality. Both categories, i.e. race and gender, are a consequence of the biologic of Western culture. Thus, in the colonial situation, there was a hierarchy of 4, not 2 categories. Beginning at the top, there were men, European men. Then women, European women, that is. Then native, which is African men, and then other African women. And she says, native women occupied the residual and unspecified category of the other. And then a little bit later, she says that the colonizer differentiated between male and female bodies and acted accordingly. Men were the primary target of policy, and as such, they were the natives and so were visible. And she says these facts, from the perspective of from the standpoint of this study, are the justification for considering the colonial impact in gender terms. So, yeah, very important, laying out that, you know, that's the hierarchy. White man, white woman, African man equals native, and then African woman, other, kind of invisible, not really a subject for most colonial policies. And then, but then she says something which another thing which I love, frankly, is that she says that she basically, although she set the stage for discussing colonialism's impact in gender terms, she departs from feminists who have done this and who have developed this idea of double colonization, or double, I think she called, is it double colonization, double colonization, yeah. So she talks about how, she mentions one person, Stephanie Urdang's book, Fighting Two Colonialisms, is characteristic of this perspective of, you know, the idea that African women, basically, under colonialism, they were being colonized by the colonizer, but they were also being colonized by men, African men, by black men, by their quote unquote men. And she says, she rejects that idea of double colonialism, and she says this, she says, while the depth of the colonial experience for African women is expressed succinctly by the idea of doubling, there is no consensus about what is being doubled. What's being doubled? Is colonization being doubled? I.e., she's saying, and she says, no, it's not colonization being doubled. And by extension, what she's doing here, which is an important thing, she's not falling into the trap of basically trying to pit African men and African women against each other, which is, I think, what happens when people talk about this kind of thing, dual oppression, you know, all this kind of stuff. What she's saying, at least with regard to the colonial context, she's saying that no, it was the colonizers. The colonizers were, the impact of colonization on African women was twofold, not the colonization itself. And she says this, she says, from my perspective, it is not colonization that is two, but the forms of oppression that flowed from the process of colonization for native females. Hence, it is misleading to postulate two forms of colonization because both manifestations of oppression are rooted in the hierarchical race/gender relations of the colonial situation. And then she summarizes this. This is the summary. African females were colonized by Europeans as Africans and as African women. They were dominated and exploited and inferiorized as Africans together with African men, and then separately interiorized and marginalized by, as African women. And then so that's her point there. She's not going to start talking about, African men were colonizing African women. No, she's saying that the colonizer colonized all of them, African men and African women, but in that process, and the next section we're going to go on to, she's going to show how the African women, our African ancestors, female ancestors, were marginalized as another kind of a layer of the impact of colonialism. So we're going to go straight into the next section, which is going to talk mainly about where are we? Education, I think. Yeah, she thought eventually we're going to talk about education, but let me just a couple of comments here. Shout out to peace and blessings to everyone who's here. Leah Boogs, peace. Yeah, hope you're well. Peace to you. And then Desaline said, going back to last week, she did mention the slave trade as a disruptive factor in another book called African Women and Feminism. Ooh, okay. Let me jot that down. This week, I've got a pen and paper because so much comes out of these conversations that sometimes I have to watch the whole thing again to remember what was said. So African Women and Feminism. And I'll put discusses slavery. Yeah. All right, good. Thank you. So let's move on then. She's going to start getting into it a little bit more and unpacking it a little bit more. So the next section of this chapter, and let me just say, I'm not going to read I'm not going to cover all of the chapter in detail, but I'll cover most of it in some detail. So the next section is called The State of Patriarchy. And she should have probably underlined the state, so that the meaning of that term means. She says this. She says, the imposition of page 123, by the way, the imposition of the European state system with its attendant legal and bureaucratic machinery is the most enduring legacy of European colonial rule in Africa. The international nation-state system, as we know it today, is a tribute to the expansion of European traditions of governance and economic organization. And I just want to say there that one of the next things I'll probably cover is African Anarchism, which is a very, very small book by someone called Sam Barr and another writer called Igariwe. But because I think often we in all of these discussions we sometimes forget that while the Yoruba did have a state, colonialism transformed, introduced a much more comprehensive concept of the state into Yoruba society. And Oyewumi makes a point later on that the power of the state was massively increased under colonialism, whereas previously the Yoruba state, the Alafin, the Oba, and the Council of Elders and all that sort of stuff didn't have nearly as much power over people's lives. But we'll come back to that. But that's just an important point. She says, one tradition that was exported to Africa during this period was the exclusion of women from the newly created colonial sphere. In Britain, access to power was gender-based. Therefore, politics was largely men's jobs. And colonization, which is fundamentally a political affair, was no exception. And the point that she's making there is that African women were excluded from this newly created, newfangled kind of space of the state, of this newfounded bureaucratic space of colonial of the state, the bureaucracy and all that sort of stuff. African women were were excluded from that, and she's, you know, that has very, very, very real repercussions for the stuff that she is going to talk about in her conversation. Just burning some sage because I figured that I watched Daughters of the Dusts the other day for the first time, and it just really spoke to me on so many different levels. And I'm like, yeah, listen, I need to start doing stuff like, you know, I need to start being more making more of an effort to kind of connect with the spiritual realm and with our ancestors and whatnot. So that's what that's all about. So yeah, so that's that. So she talks about this, and she says that, for example, in British colonialism, one of the things that some of my relatives have said, like, you know, almost like, what's the word? Almost proudly have said, oh yeah, no, Uganda wasn't a colony, it was a protectorate. No, it was a protectorate, not a colony. Whoa. And, you know, they talk about how, the British, it was indirect rule. They weren't like I don't know who else, the Portuguese or the French, you know, who it was all direct rule. No, the British were indirect rule. They left us to basically do what we wanted to do, and we had our rulers and our chiefs and so forth. You know, so and Oyewumi talks about this system of indirect rule and says on page 124 that the system of indirect rule introduced by the British colonial government recognized the male chief's authority at the local level, but did not acknowledge the existence of female chiefs. Therefore, women were effectively excluded from all colonial state structures. And then she points out to the irony that one of the signatories to a treaty that was said to have basically given the British control over Yoruba land. I'll read it here. Page 125. She said, yet on the eve of colonization, there were female chiefs and officials all over Yoruba land, which won't surprise you if you've been part of our previous conversations, because, yeah, anyway, we'll talk about that again a little bit later. And she says, ironically, one of the signatories to the treaty that was said to have ceded Ibadan to the British was Lanlatu, an Iyalode, and a female chief. So while the British were excluding women from the political sphere, one of the reasons they claimed to even have authority over Yoruba land was because of a woman who signed this so-called treaty. You know, so I just thought that was interesting. Now, so she talked about this indirect rule and these chiefs, and she makes a really important point that even in African societies which had centralized hierarchical power structures, such as Yoruba land, their power was checked by various different bodies and advisors, you know, boards of councils and that sort of stuff. And they were not gendered, by the way. That's a very, really important point, is that the power of the rulers in Africa, at least in Yoruba land, and I'm sure it will be the case in many other parts of Africa, where even if they did have hierarchical power structures, which not all Africans did, by the way, my people, the Bagisu, did not have centralized hierarchical power structures. We had no chiefs, no king, no nothing like the queen or royalty, anything like that. But I think it is important to consider the fact that even the centralized entities, polities in Africa prior to colonialism that did have the royal families and all that kind of stuff had, you know, these monarchs or whatever did not have absolute power, by the way. And then she says on page 125 that, quote, the alienation of women from state structures was particularly devastating because the nature of the state itself was undergoing transformation. Unlike the Yoruba state, the colonial state was autocratic. The African males designated as chiefs by the colonizers had much more power over the people than was vested in them traditionally. In British West Africa in the colonial period, male chiefs lost their sovereignty, i.e. they couldn't do whatever the heck they wanted to do anymore, but they increased their powers over the people. Although we are to believe that their powers derived from tradition, even where the British created their own brand of traditional chiefs. Sorry. Anyway, the point there is that You know, we moved to a situation in Yoruba land and in many other parts of Africa that were colonized where the power of local rulers was magnified massively. You know, so they lost their sovereignty, but they gained much more power over people's affairs. And we're going to see a bit more of that in a second. So, and then, page 126, she says, in pre-British Yoruba society, adjudication of disputes rested with lineage elders. And again, that's Obinrin and Okunrin. There's no, that the elders thing wasn't gendered. Therefore, very few matters came under the purview of the ruler and the council of chiefs. But in the colonial administration, the native authority system, with its customary courts, dealt with all civil cases, including marriage, divorce, and adultery. She then goes on to do what she does a lot of really, really well. She then goes on to show that actually this increasing encroachment of the state into people's affairs was not an accident, but rather it reflected the history of Europe itself. So she points out that when you look at ancient Rome and ancient Greece and even traditional European societies, you know, after that time, you see this. You see that their state structures had a lot of power over people's lives, or at least claimed to have a lot of power over people's lives. I'm sure some people might push back at Oyewumi here and say, no, they say that, but actually they couldn't do that. But, you know, at least they're claiming it here. The fact that they're claiming it, you know, is important. So she says she quotes from a historian called Fustel de Coulanges, who does an analysis of the Greek city-states. You know, ancient Greece, that, you know, we're told that Greece, the fathers of civilization, and ancient Greece was so wonderful, and shouldn't we just all worship at the feet of the ancient Greeks? Well, no, we shouldn't, fam, because look at this. Quote, there was nothing independent in man in these ancient city-states. His body belonged to the state and was devoted to its defense. If the city had need of money, it could order the women to deliver up their jewels. Private life did not escape the omnipotence of the state. The Athenian law, in the name of religion, forbade men to remain single. Sparta, 300, anybody? Sparta punished not only those who remained single, but those who married late. In Athens, the state could prescribe labor, and at Sparta, idleness, i.e., in Sparta, they could force people to be idle. In Athens, they could force people to work. It, that is the state, exercised its tyranny in the smallest things. At Locri, the laws forbade men to drink pure wine. At Rome, Miletus, and Marseille, wine was forbidden to women. And then she quotes from someone called Edward Shorter, who's writing about European societies. Quote, traditional European communities regulated such matters as marital sexuality or the formation of the couple. I'll read from here. Or the formation of the couple. To mention a few examples, there was a fornication penalty against women who were pregnant out of wedlock, no bridal crowns for pregnant brides, and before a man was allowed to join a guild, the guild insisted not only that the man himself not be illegitimate or even conceived before marriage, but that his parents be respectably born as well. Above all, the community had the power to halt marriages. We must not forget that in Europe at this time, women were largely excluded from formal public authority. Therefore, the public policy referred to by Shorter was male constituted. And then Oyewumi says, no doubt some of these matters were regulated by African societies, but the regulation was in the hands of the lineage and possibly non-familial opinion. Consequently, the probability that any one category of people, such as anatomical females, could have been excluded from the decision-making process of the family was much less than in Europe. And I just think that's just such an important thing to bear in mind, that when we're talking about Europe and we're talking about Africa, you know, the state was much more powerful. States were much more powerful and demanded much more control over people's lives than they did in other parts of the world. In Yoruba society, at least. I just thought that was really, really, really interesting. That whenever people bring up ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and oh, look at us white people, where's your Rome, where's your Greece? Well, It's in our culture, and it's in our traditions. And when we look at our culture and traditions and compare them with your culture and traditions, I'm afraid to say that your culture and traditions look pretty horrendous in comparison to our culture and traditions. A point that Sophie Olewule makes when she talks about various things. Peace out to you, peace and blessings, Ma Bunia, I believe. Nice to see you here, my family, Yaya. Cool. All right, and then so one of the things I like what she does here. I like what Oyewumi does here. She talks about this idea that African women experience benefits from colonialism. You might have heard it. Oh yeah, under colonialism, because of colonialism, African women had got more rights and more freedom. They were freed from the crushing burden of the patriarchy of African traditional societies. And as we've seen in other chapters, in the previous chapter, this idea that African or Yoruba traditional society was crushingly patriarchal and so forth just doesn't hold up to scrutiny, frankly. And so she tackles this point about did African women actually benefit some from, or anyone? Did anyone benefit? Did any Africans benefit somewhat from colonialism, really? And she says this on page 127 and 128, and I'm going to read this in a little bit of length. She says, in her study on the effects of British rule on women in southwestern Nigeria, Nina Mba concludes that the colonial marriage ordinance increased women's legal status because it enhanced women's rights to marital property. So that sounds, if put it this way, if I had never read this book and had no idea about Oyewumi and Nzegu and Olewule and I would have just been like, all right, yeah, cool. All right, fair enough. Yeah, you got us there. Colonialism definitely did give women property rights, which they didn't have before. But not so fast, says Oyewumi. Quote, to start with, her assumption of the status of wives as identical with the status of women leads to her inability to grasp the fact that in the cultures of southwestern Nigeria, the rights of females as wives, as daughters, and as sisters derived from different bases. For example, lack of access to their husband's property did not constitute secondary status for women because as daughters and sisters, they had rights to both lineages, that is, to their fathers, their mothers, and their brothers' properties. So that's something that we covered in chapter 2, I believe. The whole, when it comes to inheritance, that's what we covered. The fact that a person, a wife, an ayah could inherit, or actually a female, not even an ayah, an obinrin could inherit from their fathers, from their mothers, and in some cases, complicated cases, but in some cases could inherit from their siblings' property. Quite a convoluted way, but they could. And then, quote, in the past, conjugal oko, that is conjugal husbands, could not inherit their ayah's property either. So, you could say, before colonialism, the Africans, the Yoruba women couldn't inherit from their husbands, but Yoruba husbands could not inherit from their wives either. And then, quote, so the apparent provision of marital property rights in colonial law was not necessarily a good thing for women, because the constitution of a new category of property called marital property under colonialism by the British, which that concept of marital property, a marital estate, all that sort of stuff, didn't exist in Yoruba society prior to colonialism, Oyewumi argues. And that's something that I find very, very fascinating, very exciting, and I'd love to delve into that more, because I think we could probably there's things we could probably learn from that as far as our conceptions of marriage and that sort of stuff in this day and age. But she says that the introduction of this concept of marital property meant that wives lost their independent property rights. All those other property rights that they had, they could inherit from their mothers, from their fathers, from their siblings, and also they could just have their own stuff that it was just theirs and didn't become automatically part of their husbands. This was actually the new system under colonialism was a downgrade because they lost their independent property rights. Sorry, quote, and by the same token, husbands could now take over their wives' property, which they couldn't do beforehand. Moreover, the positioning of wives as the beneficiaries of husbands also meant that the rights of some other women, such as mothers, sisters, and daughters, were abrogated as well. I won't belabor the point, but again, women obìnrin in Yoruba society had rights to property through various different elements of their social identity, whereas now only wives could become beneficiaries of their husbands. And then, quote, we must also remember that many Nigerian societies had polygamous marriage systems, which raises the complex question as to which wives inherited what property, given that some wives had been married to the same husband longer than others. Mba does not deal with any of these issues. Finally, her faith in the legal system as a way of, quote unquote, improving women's status is unwarranted, given the same colonial system had constituted women into second-class subjects. Legal systems do not work in a vacuum, and men, for reasons that will be discussed later, were in a better position to take advantage of the newfangled legal system. In sum, the idea that women, or for that matter, any category of people among the colonized, benefited from colonial rule does not reflect reality, unquote. So, woo! Just in that little example there, she just like forensically kind of goes through. It's like, you know, you said this, but actually no, because A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And that's why I'm glad that we've read the whole book, because we wouldn't have really been able to understand any of this stuff if we hadn't have read chapters 2 in particular. So yeah, that's just really important there. And so that's the kind of the main kind of like the overall picture. She's now going to go in to talk about specific areas of Yoruba society. And the first thing she's going to talk about is education, which as I've posted a couple of times elsewhere, education was all about the church. So we're going to come on to that in a minute, but let's check in on some of the comments here. So where are we here? So, okay, cool. So coming back to, peace, Tito District. What's going on? What's going on? Yeah. Hope you're well. Yeah. Means sibling, by the way. Gender neutral Lugisu term from East Africa, from Uganda. So peace, welcome. And do make sure you like the video, by the way, everyone. Sorry, just like it for the algorithm. So yeah, so that book, African Women and Feminism, which Desalene's brought up. A little bit more information about that book here. Its full title is African Women and Feminism, Reflecting on the Politics of Sisterhood, published by Africa World Press, and it's about 250 pages. Okay, good. So Desalene says that, again, she rejects the sisterhood of the quote-unquote sisterhood of Western feminism. Absolutely. And Jatem Ross said, because Western feminism essentially means white women's empowerment, ? Now, Leah Books said, I'm wondering if the meaning and the role of a king and or chief in Africa has the same meaning as a monarchical king in the West. In radical left circles, we want to get rid of kings because of the class, class implications for good reasons, but there's a tendency to assign the same paradigm to African chiefs and kings. However, I don't think it's a one-to-one relationship. And you said, sorry for the typos. Can't see any typos with my bad eyesight and not great writing myself. But yeah, I think so. So here's the thing. I'm very interested in the whole area of anarchism, if you want to call it that. The reality that many African systems, societies, potentially most African societies in history prior to colonialism did not have hierarchical power structures. They did not develop a state. But that doesn't necessarily mean that as I said earlier, that doesn't necessarily mean that those places that did develop a state, it looked so. Monarchs, for example, that doesn't necessarily mean that monarchs in the African kind of traditional pre-colonial context had the same powers as monarchs in the European context. And I think we see that. I think we've kind of seen that already in this book. That Oyewumi has kind of shown that a lot of things were kind of like adjudicated within families, within lineages, rather than rather than by monarchs. And I think that's really interesting. I think we can probably learn quite a bit from that, as far as like how we consider states these days. I mean, I consider myself to be an anarchist, in that I don't think that we should have hierarchical power structures, but by the same token, there needs to be some kind of mechanism for kind of ordering and ensuring that our societies kind of can meet the needs of its people, defend itself, and so forth. But I suppose it's about the detail of how that happens. And so checks and balances, making sure there's as much as possible decision making is bottom up rather than top down, and that sort of stuff. So I think that's definitely, we'll look at this book, African Anarchism, I think, by Sam Barr. Tito District mentioned, I mentioned that to you as well, in our Patreon conversations. And yeah, so we'll definitely touch on that. And then Jitem Ross said, I believe it was mentioned that the British monarchy imposed male gender into leadership during colonialism in Uganda as an example. I'm assuming leadership was open to men and women pre-colonialism. So that's one of my things. One of the things at the moment that's frustrating me is that, much as I'm absolutely loving the amount of scholarship that's coming from the likes of Oyewumi and Nzegwu and various others, I'm not seeing much in relation to East Africa, where I'm from, which is annoying, because I mean, I know Nigeria is like 200 million people or whatever, and another X amount of millions outside of Nigeria, and I get it. Uganda's only 40 million. There's not many comparatively, but it's just annoying that it's not very easy for me to sort of try to start to learn about pre-colonial Ugandan societies, East African societies. Obviously, I've got my family, so what I need to start doing is, start doing some ethno-history, or whatever you might want to call it, like speaking to some of my family members and trying to get some understanding on that. But I would assume that it would have been a similar case in Ugandan societies as well. I would assume. So, for example, in the Baganda, which is one of the dominant societies in the Ugandan region, in my head, the Kabakas, the kings, that's who Kabaka Pyramid named himself after. He named himself after the title of the king amongst the Baganda, which probably means that Kabaka Pyramid could probably never travel to Uganda to concert, because then Baganda will be like, yo, you better call yourself Pyramid. You better drop that term Kabaka, because you'll get beaten up if you. But in my head, all the Kabaka going back in history were male, because I just assumed that they were male. But using the work of Oyewumi, as she did with the Alafin, the so-called king list of the Yoruba, as a guide, it wouldn't surprise me if a similar thing has happened in the writing of Baganda history. That actually maybe the rulers in the Buganda region were not necessarily gendered. And then last comment for this bit, Leah Boogs said, kings and chiefs have spiritual roles, as well as dealing with issues in a given village. There are that are not handled between families and persons in the village. Yeah. And that's a whole area, that whole area of the purpose and nature of rulers in pre-colonial Africa. I'm going to note that down. Rulers in pre-colonial Africa. I think that might come out in that African Anarchism book, actually, some of that. But I just noted that down for something to touch on in future. By the way, I just wanted to say, do let me know any books that you think would be good to cover in this series. By the way, I've got a couple on my agenda already that we're going to go on to, but I'm always eager to particularly in these kinds of areas of what's the word? Basic philosophical assumptions, basic philosophical positions, ontological positions, and all that sort of stuff. I'd really like to get more books on these lines and other kinds of books, African-centered, but not necessarily only African-centered, to be honest. So do chuck them in there. Message, just keep hollering at me. There's a few. I think it was Everything Is Politics was the one who got Oyewumi or Oyeronke Oyewumi back onto my radar. So yeah, really appreciate all your comments and your thoughts, and thank you, Leah Books. Yeah, it's a really good discussion. All right, and also you can sign up to the email list as well if you haven't already done so. Just go to elioananda.substack.com and you can sign up there. You can do it for free, or you can do it for you can donate as well. Set up a regular donation. Cool. All right. So let's talk about the church. Let's talk about education. Education. So on page 129, we have this explosive first paragraph, which I'm going to read. She says, Oyewumi says, I'll just read it from here. I've got it here on screen. The introduction of Christianity and Western education was critical to the stratification of colonial society along both class and gender lines. The initial disadvantage of females in the educational system is arguably the main determinant of women's inferiority and lack of access to resources in the colonial period and indeed in the contemporary period. How did this happen? Well, in the first half century of British colonization in Yoruba land, Christianity and Western education were inseparable because they were the monopoly of Christian missionaries. The school was the church, and the church was the school. From the point of view of missionaries, the process of Christianizing and educating the African heathens was to be a process of Europeanization. The goal of missionaries was to transform African societies, not preserve them, unquote. And I knew that already. I knew that during colonialism, it was the missionaries who did the schooling. And one thing I do know as well is that my dad's dad went to a missionary school. And so this section of this book is very personal because I'm just thinking to myself, oh Lordy. So these dynamics that we're about to touch on, some of these dynamics that occurred as a result of women and males and females basically being, put into certain social category, created, first of all, men and women being created as social ontological categories, because that they didn't exist before, really. Obinrin was not a cognate for woman, and Okunrin was not a cognate for man because they did not have all of the social ramifications. It was just anatomical designations. What was I saying? So it's quite jarring. It's quite sad and sobering for me to think that actually what we're discussing here probably happened in my family as well. So she says that Oyewumi says that the family was the key target for reform. And she gives one quote. Look at this. One quote from a missionary in Yoruba land who said this: "Is it proper to apply the sacred name of a home to a compound occupied by 2 to 6 or a dozen men, each perhaps with a plurality of wives?" So what jumped into my mind here was that what he's describing there, what this missionary is describing there is what we read about in chapter 2, which is the Agbo Ile, the homestead, if you like, or whatever you want to call it, where the basic living setup in Yoruba land prior to colonialism, whereby you had, there were patrilocal, meaning that descendants of a male ancestor would basically live together, and women would marry in, and they would join into this big kind of compound of various different homes. And we read about the all of the different elements of that, all of the nuanced relations between people. That a woman could be referred to as an oko, which it gets translated as husband erroneously, and a man could be referred to as an aya, and which is translated as a wife. And all of the multiple different relations and multiple different ways in which people's social standing were kind of designated and wonderful stuff. What a beautiful chapter 2 is. And then this, he calls the Yoruba heathen. This foolish colonizing idiot says, is speaking so disparagingly about the setup and saying, we can't call this a home. No, a home is a sacred thing. This is just some, and it's just such an example of, walking by sight, the Western walking by sight. They came, they looked, couldn't be bothered to really understand what was going on, assumed it to be just a whole bunch of mess, and then proceeded to actually, get rid of it. Get rid of that, change the way that we used to live, the Yoruba used to live together, and so on. So So that was annoying. So she says spiritual rebirth and the reconstruction of African societies were intertwined in the minds of the missionaries. One thing she talks about here, like she, Oyewumi mentions how a lot of Babalawos, so priests, Yoruba Ifa priests, I think is a description of that. A lot of Babalawos would send their girls to class, and so we'll talk about that reason. We'll talk about the reasons for that a little bit later on. But the thought of that was just like, oh gosh, man, you'd think that the Babalawos would be the ones who would be like the most sensitive to the impact that this newfangled schooling was going to have, and the negative impact, the destructive impact that this newfangled schooling would have. But it made me think about the shiny new things. When something's shiny and new, oh yeah, let's have some of that, let's have some of that. Yeah, very, very, very sad, very, very sad. But interestingly, she talks about a few things which I'll just summarize. I won't read a lot of these, but she talks about how girls and boys were both, they were both sent to school, but it was done differently. But she talked about how girls were, the British colonialists the missionaries would keep try to keep the girls away from their mothers, because they felt that the mothers would lead them back to their old ways. and I love that. Again, I've just watched Daughters of the Dust, and Nana Pazant, is it her? That character, she was just wonderful. I kind of feel like she looks like a relative of mine, frankly. She could, if she rocked up and said, "Hi, I'm your senge, your auntie, or your mai," I'd be like, "Yeah, all right, yeah." I mean, you look a little bit like my mom, if I'm honest. And then the guy's name, the son's name is Eli, which is basically my name. So yeah, that really. Sorry. So. What am I saying? This whole thing of these Babalawos sending keeping the girls away from the mothers, because they knew that often it would be the women, the Obwinrin, who would be the keepers of the traditions and the narratives and so on, and the practices. So of course they wanted to keep them away from the old ways, and by old, of course, the bad old ways are the ways which serve the interest of the Yoruba people. That's what it is. So that was interesting. So then we talk about the gender split, and we see this. I mean, this isn't anything new, but she says that what page is this? Oh, I haven't got the quote, but basically she said that males were seen as, basically they were educating the males for them to step into the colonial administration and run the colony. They were training the females to be pretty playthings of the males. That was it. They had no real purpose for the females except to be items of the males. And that just reflected what was going on in Victorian society at the time. That was the role of women, British women, European women at the time. And so it plays out in the kind of education that they received. So Oyewumi points out that in one example, for example, she focuses on the Mr. and Mrs. Hindera, who were these missionaries who left copious amounts of diaries and all this sort of stuff. And isn't that, they loved it? Thankfully that they did that. Thankfully, while they were like going around and stealing our stuff and killing us and enslaving us and raping us and all this sort of stuff, they were writing it down. Oh yeah, I did this and we did that, and we thankfully their weird worldview mindset kind of compelled them to write stuff down, and it's through that we get a lot of information about what was going on at that time. And these two people wrote down a lot of stuff in their diaries, and you see how, for example, girls were prevented from, boys would do more maths and arithmetic and all this sort of stuff than girls did, whereas girls would do more things like sewing, embroidery and all that sort of stuff, because that's what you're talking about when you talk about gender roles and stuff like that. Yes, that is how Western concepts of gender are operationalized. This is how girls become girls and boys become boys, in the sense of girls are socialization of gender roles. Girls are basically farmed into this, they're put on this trajectory of pretty little thing for their male owner. And I say owner, I mean owner. They're set up to be playthings of their owners, their males, while the males are being set up to run the country and do this, that, and the other. And then she makes a point that higher education initially was for men only for many, many decades. You know, men far outnumbered females in higher education. And then she gives quite a nice example of some of the subtle ways in which genderization happens. So this is on page 131, and I'll read it. It says this: apart from the day-to-day example of separate spheres for, I've not quoted it properly, sorry. Apart from the day-to-day example of separate spheres for Mr. and Mrs. Hindra, these are these two white British European missionaries, there were more subtle ways in which gender-biased messages were inculcated into the children. For instance, when Mrs. Hindra received a parcel of goodies from England, she gave each of the, this is quoting from Mrs. Hindra now, she gave, quote, each of the girls one of the nice little handkerchiefs and a pretty pin to fasten it, to their very great delight, and they looked so neat and tidy the next Sunday at church. Oh, damn. Fire bun, man. The boys had their share of guns and tops, but a pencil and piece of paper is their crowning pleasure, unquote. Oyewumi says, the message was plain. The boys were educated to become clerks, catechists, pastors, missionaries, diplomats, and even politicians, maybe soldiers, you could add to that. The role of the girls was to look dainty and attractive, ready to become wives and helpmates of these potentially powerful men. Lord have his mercy. So yeah, so that's what education was all about. You know, the church was going in there, and they were basically going to go in there and turn. You know, they were at the cutting edge. They were the vanguard, the colonial vanguard. The church was the colonial vanguard, and this might offend. You know, maybe it might offend some people, but I don't. Why would you be? Even if you're Christian, why on earth would you be offended